Dorothea Puente looked like a sweet grandmother, but looks can be deceiving. In fact, Puente was a serial killer who committed at least 9 murders inside her boarding house in Sacramento, California throughout the 1980s. Between 1982 and 1988, the elderly and disabled people living in Dorothea Puente's house had no idea that she was poisoning and strangling some of her guests before burying them on her property and cashing their social security checks. For years, the disappearances of these so-called shadow people, who lived at the margins of society, went unnoticed. But eventually, police searching for a missing tenant spotted a patch of disturbed dirt near the boarding house and uncovered the first of several bodies. This is the disturbing story of Dorothea Puente, the death house landlady. Dorothea Helen Gray was born on January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California, into a troubled family. Her father, Jesse James Gray, was a World War I veteran, and her mother, Trudy Mae Gray, was an alcoholic. Puente's early life was defined by instability, neglect, and abuse, which deeply affected her development and worldview. Jessie Gray was ill with tuberculosis and eventually died when Dorothea was just 8 years old. Shortly after, her mother, Trudy, who struggled with alcoholism, died in a motorcycle accident. These tragedies left Dorothea and her siblings orphaned at a young age, and they were placed in foster care, where she experienced further emotional and physical trauma. The foster care system in the 1930s was notoriously underregulated, often placing children in homes where they were exploited or mistreated. Dorothea's time in foster care contributed to her feelings of abandonment and mistrust. Some experts argue that her early exposure to these harsh conditions may have helped shape the manipulative and deceptive behaviors she exhibited later in life. Her ability to blend into society, assume false identities, and manipulate others may have stemmed from a deep-seated need to survive and control her environment. Puente ran away from foster care several times during her teenage years. She was known to lie about her age and background, often telling people she had royal or wealthy lineage. Her early life of deception became a recurring theme throughout her adult years, as she assumed multiple false identities and committed various petty crimes. Puente struck out on her own when she was 16. In Olympia, Washington, she tried to make a living as a prostitute. At 16, Dorothea married Fred McFall, a soldier who had just returned from World War II. The marriage was short-lived, as Puente began displaying erratic behavior. She gave birth to 2 daughters, but eventually sent them to live with relatives, or placed them for adoption, suggesting an inability to form close maternal bonds. After her divorce, Puente engaged in a series of crimes, including check forgery, for which she was arrested multiple times throughout the 1940s, and 1950 seconds. She married multiple times, and her relationships were often short-lived due to her volatile behavior. Each marriage ended either in divorce or death, further reinforcing Puente's sense of isolation and the necessity of deception for survival. In 1960, Puente was convicted of running a brothel in Sacramento under the guise of a boarding house. This was her first brush with a more serious criminal enterprise. While she served a short jail sentence, Puente learned how to navigate legal systems, and her time in prison did little to deter her criminal activities. Upon release, she continued her life of fraud, lying about her history and background. Throughout the 1960s and 1970 seconds, Puente consistently used false names and identities to avoid detection by the authorities. She often posed as a nurse or caregiver, allowing her to gain access to vulnerable individuals whom she could exploit financially. By the late 1970s, Puente had established a reputation as a trustworthy figure among elderly and disabled communities, paving the way for her future criminal endeavors. The 1980s saw Dorothea Puente escalate her criminal activities to a new and deadly level. She began operating a boarding house at 1426 F Street in Sacramento, where she housed elderly, disabled, and mentally ill tenants. Puente carefully selected her victims, focusing on those who were socially isolated and had little or no family support. Social workers in the 1970s looked upon Dorothea Puente and her boarding house with admiration. Puente had a reputation for taking in people considered tough cases, But behind the scenes, Puente had embarked on a path that would lead her to murder. She lost her first boarding house after getting caught signing her own name to tenants' benefit checks. In the 1980s, she worked as a personal caretaker who drugged her clients and stole their valuables. By 1982, Puente was sent to prison for her thefts. She was released just 3 years later, although a state psychologist diagnosed her as a schizophrenic with no remorse or regret, who should be closely monitored. Instead, Dorothea Puente opened up her second boarding house. There, she quickly got back to her old tricks. Puente took in so-called people who were marginally homeless, without close family or friends. Some of them began to disappear, but no one noticed. Even probation officers who stopped by accepted Puente's explanation that the people living at her house were guests or friends, not boarders. In April of 1982, a 61-year-old woman named Ruth Monroe moved into Dorothea Puente's house. Soon after, Monroe died from an overdose of codeine and acetaminophen. When the police arrived, Puente told them that Monroe had been depressed due to her husband's terminal illness. Satisfied, the authorities ruled Monroe's death a suicide and moved on. In November 1985, Dorothea Puente hired a handyman named Ismael Flores to install some wood paneling in her home. After Flores finished the job, Puente had one more request: to build her a 6-foot-long box so she could fill it with books and a few other assorted items before the pair of them would bring the box to a storage facility. But on the way to the storage facility, Puente abruptly asked Flores to pull over near a riverbank and just push the box into the water. On New Year's Day, a fisherman spotted the box, noticed that it looked suspiciously like a coffin, and informed the police. Investigators soon found the decomposing body of an elderly man inside. However, it would be 3 more years before authorities could identify the body as one of the tenants in Dorothea Puente's house, a serial killer's den of horrors. It wasn't until 1988 that suspicions first arose about Puente, after one of her tenants, 52-year-old Alvaro Montoya, went missing. Montoya struggled with mental health issues and had been homeless for years. He'd been referred to Dorothea Puente's house because of her sterling reputation welcoming people like him. Unlike many who passed through Puente's boarding house, however, someone had their eye on Montoya. Judy Moyes, an outreach counselor with Volunteers of America, became suspicious when Montoya vanished, and she didn't buy Puente's explanation that H left on vacation. Moyes alerted police, who went to the boarding house. They were met by Dorothea Puente, an elderly woman with big glasses, who repeated her story that Montoya was simply on vacation. Another tenant, John Sharp, backed her up. But as the police prepared to leave, Sharp slipped them a message: "She's making me lie for her." The police returned and searched the house. Finding nothing, they asked permission to dig up the yard. Puente told them that they were welcome to do so, and even provided an extra shovel. Then, she asked if it would be okay if she went to buy a coffee. The police said yes, and started to dig. Dorothea Puente fled to Los Angeles. The police dug up 78-year-old Leono Carpenter, and then 6 more bodies. The discovery of the bodies shocked the community, and led to a full-scale investigation into Puente's activities. Puente was not immediately arrested, and she used the opportunity to flee to Los Angeles. While on the run, Puente stayed in a motel in Los Angeles, where she attempted to blend into the city's homeless community. However, her face had been plastered all over the news, and a man at a bar recognized her. He reported her to the police, and Puente was arrested shortly thereafter. Her capture brought an end to her reign of terror, but it also raised questions about how she had managed to escape detection for so long. Throughout the trial, Dorothea Puente was portrayed as either a sweet grandma-like type, like fellow little old lady. Her lawyers argued that she might be a thief, but not a murderer. Pathologists testified that they hadn't been able to fix the cause of death for any of the corpses, claiming that her tenants had died of natural causes, and that she had buried them out of kindness. However, the jury did not believe her story, and she was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Dorothea avoided the death penalty and was instead sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Dorothea Puente died in 2011 at the age of 82, while serving her life sentence in a California prison. Despite her conviction, she continued to maintain her innocence until the end of her life. But what do you think? Was she innocent and a victim of bad luck? Let me know in the comments, and share cases you would like to see next. Till next time.